Welcome, everybody. We're back on Left Opposition. I am Eamon,
And I'm Reed.
and today we are going to be diving into the history of the Socialist Party of America. Initially, we were talking about doing maybe like a three-part series. However, we are going to take a different approach today and use an article from my old Trotskyist sect called When the Socialist Party Was a Factor in US Politics. I don't think it's the best article in the world. I don't think you learn a whole lot from it, but it gives a good general overview of the kind of typical Marxist sectarian approach to that history. And so this will help us unpack some of the common maybe misconceptions. I'll summarize the article because, again, this is a topic that I am not familiar with, really. This will be a learning experience for me, and I hope the audience as well. So let's start with what the article's perspective is. The first thing that they mentioned really is that there's the subjective and the objective factors of revolution, and the Trotsky has always emphasized the subjective factor, which is leadership for them and the importance of leadership. And they talk about how in the United States, the Socialist Labor Party, which was I guess, a party that existed beforehand, they were not up to the task. They had a rigid formalistic perspective. They assumed the working class would naturally gravitate to their correct line and follow the path that was laid out by Mr. Daniel. So the SPA was kind of an improvement upon this. It grew much faster than the SLP because they were not formalistic, thanks to Eugene Debs. But the leadership overall didn't appreciate the importance of Marxist theory, especially Victor Berger, the Victor Berger wing, I guess, who was a reformist, according to the article here. The party's appeal wavered from reformist to revolutionary, and no clear link was established between the two kind of, I guess, wings or modes. And it was an example of the worldwide international trap of minimum programs at the time. The other problem they cite is that there was no democratic centralism and that there was a disconnect between the middle class leadership outlook for socialism in the party and the working class base. This produced conflict and a lack of clarity. So Debs, according to them, avoided the party conflict altogether, kind of put his head in the sand, unlike Lenin. And in practice, he ended up leaving the kind of middle class reformist leadership to just run the show without much connection to what was going on with the working class base. Racism they bring up as one of the big problems. Now, this was written 10 years ago, 15 years ago, kind of around the height of the left's turn back to bringing up race as a main issue. So I think part of the way this article is written is just reflective of that particular time.
So
Uh,
Black Lives Matter really
Black
first
Lives
kind of
Matter, yeah,
came
yeah,
around and all that.
all
The
that
end of
stuff.
the Obama administration, there was a lot of anxiety about the race question as it was left by all that period.
Exactly, yeah. So I think this article itself is a product of its time a little
That's
bit.
right.
But they say that Debs opposed racism himself, but he didn't think it was a special problem that needed to be taken up. This is the Debs quote here. We, the SP, Socialist Party of America, have nothing special to offer the Negro, and we cannot make separate appeals to all races. So they say in the article, in order to win over the black workers and youth, the party has to be seen as addressing their problems. The Socialist Party needed to take the lead in fighting Jim Crow and lynching in particular at the time. And this is why they gained very little black worker support, according to them. Another big issue they bring up is industrial workers and the issue with the unions there. Debs founded the IWW, and they say this was a mistake, that the real work was in patiently winning over the AFL to a radical socialist position, as the leadership would inevitably expose itself over time, even though it didn't seem good at the time. You had to kind of just be patient, wait it out, and that the workers would finally see the error.
The
Yeah,
error of the existing AFL leadership and be won over to socialist leadership and
that's
all that.
right.
And this is, Lenin's argument, especially in the period of 1917, 1918.
They say that they chose pragmatism over Marxist theory.
Just it's a little ironic he puts it that way because there's a kind of pragmatism to it, but it's also a kind of idealism. The IWW it's a weird, and we can go into the details of this in the future, but it is pragmatic in one way, in the sense that they are accepting their isolation from the mainstream AFL unions. But on
Mm-hmm.
the other hand, they are attaching themselves to this idea of the revolutionary union, which is a kind of idealistic
Yep.
confabulation in a way. So anyway, sorry to interrupt, but it's just an interesting way of phrasing it to describe it as pragmatism. I think I know what he means by that, but it's
Yeah, they use a lot of weird old Marxist terms in ways
yeah.
that are a little confusing. Yeah, the last thing they mention is the October Revolution. This split the party
Mhm.
and led to its eventual demise, although it took a
Mhm.
while. Be eventually become overshadowed by the rise of the Communist Party, who were full-throated kind of supporters of the Bolshevik Revolution.
Mhm.
Debs stayed in the SPA, but their influence kind of fizzled out over time after that. Yeah, this article in general, just I was kind of disappointed because some of their articles by some of their authors in this organization, like you'll learn something. You'll, even though it's this, Trotskyist, very particular kind of perspective, you'll actually learn something. This article didn't, I feel like I don't know anything about the SPA coming out of reading this, but maybe you'll help illuminate some of this for
Yeah,
us.
I don't want to be harsh. It isn't a very well written article. It's just in terms of the writing, it's a bit stilted, but also the content is extremely formulaic. I mean, if you've read a lot of, or even if you have any kind of exposure to the literature of the Marxist tradition, especially in the kind of mid to late 20th century, there are a lot of kind of formulaic expressions and ideas and ways of framing things that, for the most part, can be traced back to something Lenin said at one point or another.
Yeah.
Whether or not the formula is actually kind of an accurate representation of what Lenin was actually saying at the time. One thing I wanted to point out, not to be like a stickler, but it gives me kind of an entryway into a few things. The article doesn't actually say that Daniel De Leon founded the Socialist Labor
Right.
Party, which he didn't. So Daniel De Leon is, you may have heard that name before. He is a very eminent figure in the history of Marxism, certainly in the history of American Marxism, a kind of notorious figure in a lot of ways. And kind of rightfully so, you could say. So the way the article describes him, so there's a passage in the article: the Socialist Party of America was set up by socialists dissatisfied with the sectarian politics of the Socialist Labor Party of Daniel De Leon. So that way of phrasing it does kind of imply that it was like his organization.
Yeah.
He was actually a latecomer to that organization. So let me just finish this reading this passage before I elaborate. So the author of the article says, although in some ways De Leon was a great thinker, kind of a dubious thing to say, in my opinion, but whatever his Daniel De Leon certainly had his merits. I don't think his merits were really so much as a thinker as maybe as a propagandist, and certainly as a leader, although in a kind of questionable way. And there's qualities of leadership that are admirable even if they're not effective, so to speak, like dedication, passion doesn't necessarily mean you're a good leader, even if it means you're admirable, if you know what I
Mm.
mean. But continuing, so De Leon tended to view society in a rigid, formalistic way. He tended to have a scholastic way of approaching the working class. Rather than examining objective reality and seeking a way to intervene in it, he led his party to believe that the working class would simply come to the SLP and follow a specific path which he laid out. And then he goes on to say the SPA did not have the rigidity of De Leon, and as a result, grew much faster. So that general characterization of De Leon as this kind of rigid, formulaic, scholastic figure, sectarian leader who expected the working class to kind of follow his ideas, as opposed to, kind of taking concrete reality for what it is and engaging it at that level, is certainly like not incorrect. De Leon. So let me start by giving a kind of very brief overview of the history of the labor movement and socialism in the United States. Not so much at the level of detail that I was kind of initially intending to do, but just to kind of frame this a little bit. Um, so the United States doesn't really have the conditions for what we would think of in terms of the modern uh, class struggle, the modern labor movement that kind of developed out of industrial capitalism until the second half of the 19th century. From its first beginnings through the period of the revolution and into the first half of the 19th century, America is certainly a bourgeois society. It's a society in which social relations based on commerce, based on the free exchange of the products of labor, based on all of the various social relations that are kind of rooted in that form of society, that distinctively modern form of society. Um, America certainly has that character, and as Marx and Engels put it in various places, America is really the first place, and in a sense, the only place in the world in which bourgeois social relations are able to develop on their own basis, independently of the kind of remnants of the older forms of social life. And there are, say, you could say there are kind of positives and negatives to that, but leaving that aside for the moment, um, one of the kind of distinctive characteristics of America in the first half of the 19th century is not that it's not capitalist in the sense of, in the sense of completely in its own world, which it's not. Capitalism is from the beginning a kind of international phenomenon. And just to be clear, there's capitalism can mean a lot of things. That word can mean a lot of things. The word doesn't really come into use until the mid 19th century, not in the way we use it today. Not really. There's not, to my knowledge, really any kind of usage of the term capitalism before the mid 19th century, other than maybe to describe the activity of a particular element of society, capitalists. And in the pre-industrial period, that would have meant like merchants and money lenders. It would have meant people that make money by trading or by loaning money, as opposed to people that live off of, directly producing things, for direct consumption. Um, Now, capitalism is often kind of identified with the bourgeois revolution, bourgeois society, which kind of first really begins to emerge in the 15th, 16th century in Europe, and really kind of consolidates itself and establishes itself as the kind of dominant form of social life on a global scale in the 17th and 18th centuries. Not in the sense that everywhere in the world has this form of social life, but in the sense that the influence of bourgeois social relations begins to completely transform the entire world in that period. And of course, we think about that in terms of like European colonialism and so on. But thinking about it in these kinds of ethnocentric terms and so on really kind of loses what's distinctive about this period, which is the way in which the very fundamental forms of social life are being transformed first in Europe, and then as a consequence of the way that transformation changes Europe's role in the world, also transforming the rest of the world to the point that now bourgeois social relations have almost completely penetrated and supplanted all of the pre-existing forms of social life, which would have been forms based on people directly producing their own means of subsistence in one form or another, or living off of the direct exploitation of those producers, right? So if you want more detail about this, I highly recommend looking at some of like Eamon's interviews with James Vaughan, for example, or really anything from James Vaughan. He's an excellent expositor of this history, but I'll leave it at there for now. But let's just say that the American Revolution and really the whole development of American colonial society before and into the revolutionary period at the, in the last half of the 19th century is an expression of this transformation of society, this bourgeois revolution, and this commercial revolution, this revolution in which people begin to live by exchanging things with others. Exchange had always existed since the dawn of civilization, but it was not within the remit of most people on Earth to ever participate in commercial exchange. Certainly not to depend upon commercial exchange for their livelihoods. That was always this, the that was always a very small minority of the world's population. In the bourgeois epoch, that becomes the dominant mode of life for everyone, over time. But capitalism per se, even though the kind of capitalists, the merchants, the money lenders, begin to take on an increasingly important and powerful role in society during the period of the bourgeois revolution, so 16th, 17th, 18th century. It's only in the 19th century, around the turn of the 19th century, that industrial capitalism begins to emerge. And in that sense, commerce begins to transform the very fundamental relations of the production process itself. And that gives rise to what we would think of as like the modern bourgeoisie. So not merchants and moneylenders, but industrial capitalists. And it also gives rise to the modern working class, the industrial proletariat, workers who live on the basis of wage labor and who are fundamentally, in a sense, stuck in the condition of wage labor for life, as opposed to wage labor being kind of a temporary condition that you can eventually get yourself out of, save up enough to kind of get your own piece of land or establish your own workshop or something like that. So America in the first half of the 19th century hasn't really felt this industrial transformation yet. It is already ongoing in Europe, especially in England. England is kind of radically transformed in this period. But the impact it's having in the United States is indirect. It's having an impact through the changing commercial and political relations. But inside American society, there isn't this transformation of the working class, at least not at a large scale in the first half of the 19th century. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Probably the most significant being there is an incredible abundance of land available. And of course, for most people in this period, the ideal was not to get a job. That's not how you wanted to make your living. The ideal was to get a piece of land where you could be an independent, where you could have your own independent livelihood, where you didn't answer to anyone, where you made your own way in the world, and so on. Or if not agricultural settlement, then becoming like a small master craftsman, artisan, something like that. Now, there is the beginnings of industrialization in the first half of the 19th century, especially in the northern cities, the northern coastal cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, places like this. But ultimately, it's difficult for large industry to develop in this period because of, for one thing, the constant loss of an available labor force to employ to this, colonization of the new territories in the West. And on the other hand, just more generally, a significant um, lack of supply of wage labor relative to the capital seeking investment. So the working class in the United States in the first half of the 19th century had a significant advantage over the European working class, where there was an overabundance of available labor. And of course, there's also the question of slavery. I'm just going to leave that to the side for now, because it would just overcomplicate the story. That is a significant element of the story as well, but I'm just going to try to simplify things for now. So the first half of the 19th century, of course, culminates in this period where tensions begin to become increasingly mentioned. Now that I mentioned slavery, where tensions begin to become increasingly, they grow increasingly heated in terms of the sectional conflict between the North and the South, but also the East and the West, primarily over the question of the expansion of slavery into the new territories. And that leads to the Civil War. Now, that's kind of the main way people narrate the history of the United States, and it's not wrong to do so. But despite what I was just saying, there is the development of the beginnings of what we might think of as a modern labor movement in elemental forms in this period. And this goes back all the way to the revolution. Now, again, we don't have a modern proletariat yet, but we do have the kinds of beginnings of the transformation of social life, more generally, the labor process, that do lead to early trade union activity and strike activity. And a lot of these elements there's a nebulous quality to these elements that they can go in different directions, but in general, they are supportive but kind of critical supporters of the kind of revolutionary project of the American Republic. So they're not necessarily like 100% on board with everything that the more elevated classes that are leading the revolutionary movement, wealthy merchants and professionals and landed gentry, they may not necessarily go in for everything that these guys are seeking, but they do have a kind of general fidelity to the ideals of the revolution, if not for the same ultimate kind of reasons, you may say, or not always necessarily in the same direction. So there is a kind of working class support for the revolutionary project. And of course, as has always been the case, the working class are the kind of soldiers, that fight the war, fight the revolutionary war and so on. There is a kind of element of labor radicalism, early labor radicalism, in the movement of the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson establishes his Republican Party, nowadays often referred to as the Democratic Republican Party. A big part of the support for that party, as opposed to the more conservative leadership of the Federalists, was a kind of small artisanal or these kind of clubs of mechanics and artisans and laborers that supported Jefferson's party for out of their own interests. They formed kind of democratic clubs and so on. And going into the period of the kind of crisis and collapse of Jefferson's party around the 1820s, there were the founding of a series of, there were the founding of several working men's parties that were independent parties representing the interests of working people. What they were fundamentally fighting for were things like limitation of the working day, public education, and also opposition to slavery, um, which they saw as kind of a direct threat to their own conditions of life. But these parties weren't able to really go very far because of the lack of a fully kind of developed proletarian class. A kind of wage laboring class had yet to develop, and as I was saying, there are all these kinds of tendencies eroding the development of such a class as it's arising. So, there is this labor radicalism in this period, but it's kind of early. It's kind of very sort of lacking coherence. It kind of ultimately comes apart. But a few things to note about this. So, in the same period, the early utopian socialists are coming to the United States and using this availability of land to set up their utopian societies, their utopian colonies, and to spread their ideas. So Robert Owen, for example, comes to the United States and tries to spread his ideas this way, and he becomes influential in the working class movement. His son is the founder of one of these working men's parties. And so there is this kind of early socialist influence on these elements as well. And there's others. There's the Fourierists. There's the Icarians, the followers of Etienne Cabet. So there are these various socialist experiments going on. And that's having an influence on this early working class movement. And then ultimately, in the period of the 1830s and the 1840s, a lot of this labor radicalism gets kind of absorbed into the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. But it forms a kind of a dissident faction within the Democratic Party and ultimately ends up splitting from the Democratic Party, along with anti-slavery elements in the Democratic Party, and merges with the anti-slavery elements that split off from the Whig Party in the same period, as well as abolitionists who had formed the Liberty Party, and they form what's called the Free Soil Party. And that becomes a kind of precursor to the Republican Party. So also in the same period, there's a lot of German immigrants coming to the United States. And these German immigrants bring socialist ideas from Europe. Oh, I should also mention that these working men's parties that I had mentioned were very influential in Europe, in terms of having an influence on the Chartist movement in England, which is a very important phenomenon. It's kind of the first real substantial working class political movement in Europe. But the working men's parties predate Chartism, despite their short life. And they also influence Karl Marx, who learns about them, and they are an influence on his developing notion in the 1840s of the working class, the modern working class, being an independent political force and being driven to independent political action by the conditions of capitalism and the development of capitalism. So I had mentioned these German emigre radicals that are coming to the United States. Some of them influenced by Marx, but various different socialist and Republican ideas. They also form various socialist and communist clubs and organizations. A lot of them join the Republican Party. A lot of them fight in the Union Army. Some of them are even at the level of officers or generals. And so, from this whole period up to the Civil War, this is kind of the picture of the influence of the kind of mutual influence of labor radicalism and socialism in the United States and in Europe. The Civil War is really the catalyst that drives the large scale industrialization of the United States. And so it's in the second half of the 19th century that you get what's called the Second Industrial Revolution. And that's when you start to get the transformation of American society in a way that wasn't happening in the first half. So part of that is the availability of land for settlement is drying up for various reasons, which I won't go into now. And then, of course, the rise of large scale industry leads to the development of a modern proletarian working class of people that are kind of stuck in the condition of wage labor for life, which, like Abraham Lincoln, for example, during the Civil War, said that was never going to happen in the United States. There was no possibility of people being stuck in this condition for life. And frankly, he had reasons for thinking that. That wasn't just kind of ideology on his part, but he was wrong about that. So then we get into the latter half of the 19th century, and just a few things before I wrap this exposition up. So in the 1860s, especially after the war ends, there are the beginnings of the development not only of modern industry. It had already been developing during the war and even before the war, but especially towards the end of the war and after the end. There are the development of new kind of forms of labor radicalism, new forms of trade union activity, strike activity, and there's also the International Working Men's Association, which had been founded in Europe, but is moved to the United States in 1872 under Karl Marx's recommendation. And if you don't know a lot about the International Working Men's Association, that could be a whole topic for a video. So I won't go over that now. But suffice it to say, there are chapters affiliated with the First International in the United States, and then, of course, when the General Council was moved to the United States, that's very significant as well. Marx kind of sent it there to die because he kind of felt that it had kind of outlived its usefulness as an organization. But he also did have a sense that the United States was going to be an extremely significant terrain for the working class struggle in the coming decades. So it wasn't just entirely a matter of kind of doing that. Now, there are these kind of chapters of the First International. There are these newly forming trade unions. There are these various kinds of organizations. An organization forms called the National Labor Union, which kind of aspires to forming an independent political party of the working class in the United States. That ultimately falls apart around in the early 1870s, but there are various remnants of that organization, as well as these various chapters affiliated with the First International, some of which go on to try to form labor parties of their own. And all of these different groups get together in the mid 1870s and begin to kind of say, well, what about forming a national labor party of some kind, a national workers' party, working men's party? And so in 1876, there is the founding of a new party, the Working Men's Party of the United States, which then the next year renames itself to the Socialist Labor Party. Now, the leading elements of this party are mostly German emigre radicals. There are some domestic labor militants and so on as well, but the party's really dominated by this kind of German element, and they remain very German. They remain not necessarily fluent English speakers. They conduct a lot of their business in the German language. They are relatively isolated, but they're also trying to overcome that isolation. The Then we have the 1870s. that is a period of intense labor radicalism in the United States. This kind of first wave of real class war, you might say, developing on a kind of large industrial scale. Most notoriously, there's a massive railroad strike in 1877, sometimes called the Great Upheaval. And there's various other kinds of elements I could go into in terms of this, but there is this kind of socialist labor party, which Daniel de Leon is not yet affiliated with, which is like sort of trying to find its way, trying to find its way um, in the working class movement, trying to make inroads, trying to spread its propaganda, beginning to take on some electoral activity, things like this. Then in the 1880s, there's this sort of recession of labor militancy as a kind of new wave of prosperity enters the picture. So there's a bit of a downturn for a while, but by the end of the 1880s, there is a kind of things are coming back again. And so then you have, during this period, you have the formation of a few organizations that are very important. Most importantly, first of all, the Knights of Labor, which is kind of branching, kind of a kind of an intermediary between the kind of old-fashioned style of labor organization, which had more of the character of kind of like fraternal organizations, almost if you think of like the Freemasons, or maybe that's not a great example because of the conspiracy theory elements, but
But the
kind of
Freemasons were big in the United States in the early.
they were, and they actually have a role to play in this story, but I'm going to leave all that out for now. But so these kinds of secret groups that have initiation rituals and have secret passwords and secret names and all these kinds of things, but it is beginning to look towards a more modern concerns and modern forms of organization. It is oriented towards something like an early kind of industrial unionism, where workers are not simply organizing on the basis of the crafts that they are part of, but on the basis of being part of the same industrial enterprise, regardless of the kind of work they do. And in fact, it's kind of the first organization that's trying to kind of build a union that embraces all workers in all industries and all crafts and so on. And it even in this period, it kind of radically seeks to organize workers regardless of race and even regardless of sex. So there is this kind of all encompassing, there are disputes within the organization around that in some places. There is ultimately a kind of exception made for the Chinese immigrants, but there is this kind of one big union type of idea beginning to emerge. But the Knights of Labor ends up going into crisis in the end, towards the end of the 1880s. The Socialist Labor Party's trying to be active in the Knights of Labor, kind of struggling to make inroads. And ultimately, the Knights of Labor come into crisis. So the Knights of Labor they're kind of anti-strike activity. They're more interested in kind of, you might say, like mutual aid and kind of building cooperatives to replace capitalist enterprises, things like that. But the developing kind of conditions of modern industry, the developing labor militancy, ultimately leads to strikes that the Knights of Labor are kind of forced to support, in terms of the leadership being forced to support them. But, this kind of condition of conflict between the organization's kind of overarching, leadership and ideals, and the kind of real conditions that their membership are confronting ultimately kind of tears the organization apart, and it kind of fragments and ultimately ends up dissolving in the 1890s and after. But part of what comes out of this is what would eventually become the AFL, which we now know as part of the AFL-CIO, which is a much more kind of conservative organization in terms of like not so much interested in these kinds of radical ideas, like socialist utopian ideas of rebuilding, reconstructing society on a different basis, the basis of cooperation as opposed to competition, these sorts of things. But it does have a kind of more modern kind of conception of the union organization, maybe for better and for worse, kind of more an organization that's more adapted to modern industrial enterprises and modern industrial conditions, as opposed to these kinds of, secret brotherhood type groups. Um, so the Socialist Labor Party comes into crisis kind of around the same period as the Knights of Labor. And it's in this period between, say, 1886 and 1889 that Daniel de Leon joins the organization and kind of takes over as a kind of intellectual leader in this period of crisis for the party, in which a lot of the party members are kind of becoming increasingly discontented with the way the party has been operating, and whether or not it's actually doing what it sets out to do, and so on. So anyway, that brings us back to the article. Now, I before I, Eamon, I wanted to see if you had any thoughts about what I was just saying. But before I do, I just wanted to note that this kind of sectarian character of Daniel de Leon and the Socialist Labor Party under him, the way the author of the article describes it, this kind of rigid, formalistic way of thinking, the scholastic approach. I think the irony here is that the article itself really kind of has that sort of approach. It has this kind of formulaic, just kind of regurgitating these ideas that aren't really fleshed out in any concrete detail. It's not really clear where these kinds of formulations are coming from. There are kinds of these various very vague and broad references to things that aren't explained very well, and a lot is taken for granted without being explained. And a lot of it, as I was saying to you before we started, Eamon, there is this sort of character to it where a lot of the formulations can be traced back to things that especially Lenin said at one point or another. Sometimes Marx, sometimes Engels, usually Lenin, sometimes Trotsky, but for the most part, Lenin. These kinds of phrases or these kinds of various formulations of Lenin will be sort of, over the course of the 20th century, repeated and regurgitated essentially over and over again in new contexts, but without the substance behind them necessarily being really taken into account. Sometimes it is more than others, but what you get is this effect that over the 20th century, this or that thing that Lenin said becomes repeated over and over and regurgitated over and over to the point of becoming kind of like a cliche. And this article is kind of nothing but a collection of cliches of that sort,
Yeah, when you get into a Trotsky's organization or even a Marxist-Leninist organization, you'll hear these terms. This was vulgar, this was economist, this was adventurous, this was formalistic.
Right.
And and it all comes back to, yeah, exactly like you said, something from Lenin mentioned a couple times, Trotsky mentioned once, maybe Marx said, but these are all they're all kind of extrapolating these terms that had particular context and particular
Mhm.
histories and imposing them on current events or events that happened afterwards in a way that seems disconnected. It's jarring to read these articles. It comes off as like an alien language reading it in today.
And it's alienating, I mean, if you tried to put this in front of some normal person, they'd be like, what the fuck am I reading?
Yeah. What's vulgar
So
mean?
yeah, no. So, there's an irony here, I think, because the author clearly has a sense that there's something about approaching things that way that's not good, not
Yeah.
that's wrong. And
There's no
and
explanation. I don't
right,
know.
right. So the funny thing is the author is advocating studying history and learning from history so that the lessons of the historical
Yeah.
experience of the movement in its development and its past failures and shortcomings can be brought to bear in the present. And that ethos, I think is
It's
very,
great.
yeah, it's great. And I think that is the ethos we should have. That is, in a sense, kind of at the heart of Marxism. That's certainly at the heart of Lenin's perspective.
Yeah, and
But
these same guys, like when they write about China, when they write about Vietnam, when they write about Chile, their articles are great. There's
hmm,
detailed explanations, and like you can see, oh, okay, I understand why this is a mistake and what can be learned and blah blah blah. But
hmm.
some of the stuff is just like this article is just a mess.
Yeah, and I don't want to beat up on it too much because I don't know. I mean, okay, this I say that, but it kind of reads like almost as if something like a high school student would write. I don't want to. That probably sounds really mean. I don't mean that to be mean, but it's at that level of like very oversimplified, very doesn't really flow as an argument so much. Like there's a lot of just kind of random formulations in there that don't really seem to follow from anything, and a lot of them come across as kind of like cliches or as
Someone
kind of
trying to impress their like mentor is what it reads like.
yeah, yeah, and almost like you took a few other articles of a similar cast and just kind of reproduced what they were saying, but in a more vague and general way. So, that's it is what it is. Again, I don't want to beat up this author too bad, but I do think it's interesting that there is this recognition of a need to learn from this history, despite an inability to seemingly do it. And in that sense, the approach is very similar to the way that De Leon is described, which is this sort of formulaic, scholastic, although at a kind of low level, not really engaging with the actual concrete, facts and the kind of actual development of historical circumstances and conditions in the process of history, but just this kind of very vague general formulaic picture of things. So I wanted to bring that out because part of what the article is arguing, it's arguing for this Marxist or Leninist conception of like leadership, revolutionary leadership, sort of Trotskyist conception of like revolutionary leadership. But what's actually displaying is that the way that people that advocate for this sort of thing actually have a very anti-Marxist idea of what that might mean, or whether or not their ideas betray that. What they're actually doing betrays that they have a kind of anti-Marxist perspective, in the sense that they really have a very sectarian idea of what it means to be a revolutionary leadership. It's we have the right ideas, we bring them to the working class. At some point, the working class will realize that we're right, and they'll flock to our banner, and then we'll have a revolution. And
Which is exactly what they said De Leon did.
right, exactly. So I wanted to, if you'll indulge me, I wanted to read a few passages from Engels that and the reason the motivation behind this. So there's one passage in this article here. I'll read this paragraph and then go from there. So the gains of the Socialist Party of America showed that even in the USA, the advanced workers would find their way to socialist ideas. However, there were many serious problems with the Socialist Party. Above all, the leadership of the Socialist Party did not understand the importance of Marxist theory as a guide to action. Now, that's a phrase, if you're at all versed in the literature of like Leninism and especially Trotskyism, you've definitely seen this phrase before. Marxist theory as a guide to action. And the reason that phrase circulates is, as I was saying before, Lenin said that. And then people repeat it without necessarily really understanding what Lenin was saying. And something that, I think you'll often see is people will attribute things to Lenin that Lenin did say, but Lenin was actually quoting Marx or Engels. And they won't acknowledge that Lenin was quoting Marx or Engels. They will attribute the phrase or the idea to Lenin, which I think just goes to show that people that are really hung up on Lenin don't necessarily appreciate where Lenin is even coming from, because they're not really seeing that Lenin is being a Marxist. This is not Lenin's ingenious originality. This is Lenin's orthodoxy. This is Lenin's like almost, almost pedantic insistence upon taking seriously what Marx and Engels were saying. So the reason I raise that is because this famous phrase of Lenin's that gets recycled over and over in all different places, Marxist theory as a guide to action, is Lenin quoting Engels. So I wanted to quote from Engels, and there's actually a few passages I wanted to read. They're a little long, but I think they're really worth going through, in a way of like providing a contrast to the sort of perspective we're getting from that article. So during his late life, after Marx's death especially, Engels was engaged in this work of sort of holding the party together on an international scale, in his kind of way of putting it, a role that him and Marx together had before that period, but he sort of took a special initiative in doing this, namely by engaging in correspondence with the party leaders of all the different countries and kind of helping to advise them on how to go about this process of leading or trying to build these organizations. And so this is from a letter that Engels wrote as part of that correspondence to one of Marx and Engels's comrades in the United States of America, Friedrich Adolf Sorge, who, for example, he was like the head of the First International when it was resituated in the United States, played a role in the Socialist Labor Party in its early phase, and so on. So this is Engels kind of giving some advice and kind of perspective on this situation in America. And he starts out by mentioning the Henry George boom. Maybe I'll just briefly mention that. So in the mid 1880s, this guy, Henry George, who's, you might say, kind of like a progressive liberal in a way, who had a sort of scheme for redressing the problems of capitalism through what he called the single tax plan, which was essentially this idea of eliminating all taxes except for a tax on land that would essentially appropriate to the state all the revenues that would otherwise go to landowners. So in a sense, it's liquidating landowners as a class, in terms of a class that lives off the revenues of land ownership, not in the sense of the state appropriating all the land, but just in the sense that all the revenues of the state would come from what would otherwise be rents on land.
Must have been
And
an
that
Adam
would,
Smith fan.
yeah, it's actually, so Marx and Engels will talk about this as like, this is just Ricardo. This is like a Ricardian idea. It's a very bourgeois idea, but
Yeah.
it does get a lot of support from the working class in the 1880s. Okay. And we'll kind of see why. And in 1886, there's actually the formation of a what's called the United Labor Party in New York, which tries to get Henry George elected as governor of governor of New York. Um, and the Socialist Labor Party participates in this, and of various other organizations, and Engels in particular is looking at this and saying, "Oh, this is very interesting and important." So this is what he has to say. The Henry George boom naturally brought a vast amount of dirty business to light, and I'm glad I wasn't there. Nevertheless, it was an epoch-making day. The Germans, he's referring here to like the Socialist Labor Party, essentially, the Germans simply have not realized how they can use their theory as a Marxism, in other words, how they can use their theory as a lever that will set the American masses in motion. They themselves do not, for the most part, understand the theory and treat it in a doctrinaire and dogmatic fashion as something which, having been learned by rote, is sufficient as it stands for any and every need. To them, it is a credo, not a guide to action. That's the quotation. Let me pause there for a second, because I think what's interesting about this formulation in Engels, but also in Lenin, is the point of it is that the theory is not something that provides all of the answers. It's not something that you simply take the theory and then you know what to do in every situation. But the way that people, when they invoke this idea of theory as a guide to action, in my experience, certainly, both practical and in reading a lot of these materials from the history of socialism in the 20th century, certainly like Trotskyism, is that people will invoke theory as a guide to action to say theory is not about thinking about things. It's about this is what you have to do. It's literally the opposite of what Engels is actually saying here. Engels is saying theory is not this dogma that is learned by rote and simply mechanically applied in kind of like a formulaic manner to real circumstances. Theory is a guide to action in the sense that it helps you understand your practical conditions and engage with them, but doesn't give you all the answers. It's the opposite of that perspective. Whereas the way it's invoked is here, this is what you have to do according to the theory. That's what people will really actually mean when they say theory is a guide to action. So I
Right.
just
And
want
it
to,
leaves
yeah,
you,
yeah.
if you think this way, it leaves you with this like set of formulas where
Mhm.
you can take anything. This is what you see in the Trotskyist and the Marxist organizations now. Every article they put out reads the same. It has the
Mhm.
same formula. There's no there's no like
Exactly.
imaginative, like there's no analysis. There's just like we've got the here it is. We just apply the formula. The problem is lack of leadership. The problem is X, Y, or Z, and they just the same answer every time. It makes for very boring reading.
Exactly. And this is what Engels is criticizing the ostensible Marxists in North America um, with doing. He's essentially, in other places he'll simply say, this is sectarianism. This is not our approach. And sectarianism is not like a different ideology from Marxism. You can turn Marxism into a sectarian idea, but that's the opposite of what our approach is, right? So, in other
Or an
words, part of what
opportunist idea.
you're right.
You can turn it into a lot of things.
Right. Well, actually, it's funny. It's so opportunism and sectarianism are kind of sometimes seen as like opposite ends
Yeah.
of a spectrum. Like sectarianism is like ultra left, like too radical for reality, and opportunism is like ultra right, like
Hmm.
too much compromising with reality.
Hmm.
But the idea is actually that you vacillate between the two positions because you don't actually have a grasp on the real circumstances. So you're just kind of going back and forth between those two.
Like
Um,
Stalinism, like what's,
right.
yeah, in the 30s.
Exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. So let me continue. So to them, to the German, ostensible Marxists in the United States, our theory is a credo and not a guide to action. Besides which, they refuse to learn English on principle. So both in terms of the theory and just general kind of cultural and organizational matters, the German Marxists are like isolating themselves from the rest of the working class, both through the theory, but also through this language barrier and kind of etc. Hence, the American masses have had to find a way on their own, and would appear to have done so for the time being in the Knights of Labor, whose muddle headed principles and ridiculous organization would seem to match their own muddle headedness. From all that I hear, the Knights of Labor are a real power, particularly in New England and the West, and are daily becoming more so as a result of the brutality of the capitalist opposition. It is, I believe, necessary to work in their midst, to form within this still fairly malleable mass a nucleus of men who know the movement and its aims, and will thus automatically take over leadership of at least some part of it when, as is inevitable, the present order disintegrates. The worst aspects of the Knights of Labor is their political neutrality, whose only result is the sharp practice of the powderlies, that's the head of the Knights of Labor, etc. But this last has had its sting drawn by the response of the masses in the November elections. Those are the elections I was referring to where they ran Henry George for governor. Um, and part of the coalition supporting Henry George for governor was the Knights of Labor. Um, but this has had its sting drawn by the response of the masses in the November elections, more especially in New York. In a country that has newly entered the movement, the first really crucial step is the formation by the workers of an independent political party, no matter how, so long as it is a distinguishable, so long as it is distinguishable as a labor party. And this step has been taken far sooner than we might have expected. And that's the main thing, that the first program of this party should still be muddle headed and extremely inadequate, that it should have picked Henry George for its figurehead, are unavoidable, if merely transitory, evils. The masses must have the time and the opportunity to evolve, and they will not get that opportunity until they have a movement of their own, no matter what its form, providing it is their own movement in which they are impelled onwards by their own mistakes and learn by bitter experience. The movement in America is at the same stage as it was at home in Germany before 1848. The really intelligent chaps will at first play the same role over there as did the Communist League before 1848 among the working men's associations, save that in America things will move infinitely faster, for it is completely unprecedented for a movement to achieve such electoral successes after an existence of barely 8 months. And what is still lacking, the bourgeois will make good. Nowhere else in the world do they behave so outrageously and tyrannically as there. Part of what I wanted to get at here is that revolutionary leadership is not simply about we study the history we learn its lessons, and then we apply those lessons to the working class as kind of like a passive material, right? The point is, these lessons mean nothing if the working class doesn't learn them themselves. And so part of
Right.
that is that they can't learn anything as a class if they're not constituted as a class. So the first most fundamental thing is that they begin to organize themselves independently as a political party, because without that there is no learning from these experiences. Without that, the trade union experience, for example, goes nowhere. Without that, all the other kinds of, any kind of revolutionary political involvement is liquidated as soon as it achieves the limited aims of the bourgeois leadership or the petty bourgeois leadership, etc. So part of the point is that nothing can be learned without this foundation of the working class organized as an independent political party. But
Right.
none of the other aspects of the theory necessarily need to come into the equation yet. Like, they can be as backward theoretically as necessary. As long as they have that starting point, they can begin to learn the lessons. And then the other element of that is the people that already are versed in the theory and understand this history and have learned its lessons need to bring those to bear in that process of working through those limitations, working through those errors, those mistakes, which are inevitable. And so I think he'll kind of put a finer point on that in this next passage. But that's kind of the gist of it, is that it's not about like we have the right answers and then we just have to get the working class to come and follow us. No, it's that the working class has to learn these lessons and we can help them learn, but they have to be in a position where they need to learn the lessons, where they're looking for illumination in terms of their difficulties in making progress in their own struggles.
This outlook treats the working class almost as an object of this enlightened classical.
Subjective element.
Yeah, these socialists, these educated, these are the subjects of history, and they're
Right.
studying the working class. They are the object.
In other words, like, the need for this theoretical illumination, for these lessons of history to come to bear, that need has to arise from within the development of the working class movement and its struggles.
Yeah.
It can't just be projected upon them, as a passive object. So it's interesting that the article kind of starts with this Lenin formulation of like there's like the objective conditions and the subjective condition, the party,
Hmm.
which isn't, wrong, but one way to think about it here is that, like, from a sectarian standpoint, the working class is simply an objective condition of revolution, and the party intellectuals, or maybe the advanced elements of the working class or whatever, but the party is the subjective condition. But, like, there's a different way of looking at this, which is that the working class starts out as kind of a passive object, but it becomes subjective, it becomes conscious in the course of its development, which is conditioned by capitalist development itself. And the kind of socialist intellectuals that are bringing these ideas for them to consider may be the conscious element at first, but they ultimately kind of become the object, in the sense of becoming the instrument that the class is using to advance itself. So there's kind of the working class from transforms from object into subject, and the socialists kind of are transformed from subjects into the object of the working class.
Right.
It's this kind of dialectical process,
Which is, yeah,
which is,
that's
yeah,
a step that kind of needs to happen
exactly.
for any revolutionary movement to actually become anything.
But maybe let's conclude by just looking at this one more passage from Engels, which I think will put a nice bow on the
Yep.
conversation. Let me say that first passage I read was from the letter Engels to Sorga, November 29th, 1886. And so now I'm just going to read a letter that Engels wrote to a woman named Florence Kelly Wichniewski, who was the translator of his Condition of the Working Class in England into English, I think, an American woman. And he wrote this letter to her December 28th of 1886. And this is just a passage from the letter. So Engels says, "It is far more important that the movement should spread, proceed harmoniously, take root, and embrace as much as possible the whole American proletariat, than that it should start and proceed from the beginning on theoretically perfectly correct lines.
Mm.
There is no better road to theoretical clearness of comprehension than to learn by one's own mistakes. And for a whole large class, there is no other road, especially for a nation so eminently practical and so contemptuous of theory as the Americans. The great thing is to get the working class to move as a class. That once obtained, they will soon find the right direction, and all who resist, Henry George or Powderly, will be left out in the cold with small sects of their own. Therefore, I think also the Knights of Labor, a most important factor in the movement, which ought not to be pooh poohed from without, but to be revolutionized from within. And I consider that many of the Germans there have made a grievous mistake when they tried, in the face of a mighty and glorious movement not of their creation, to make of their imported and not always understood theory a kind of all saving dogma, and to keep aloof from any movement which did not accept that dogma. Our theory is not a dogma, but the exposition of a process of evolution, and that process involves successive phases. To expect that the Americans will start with the full consciousness of the theory worked out in older industrial countries is to
Mm,
expect the impossible. What the Germans ought to do is to act, the Germans in America ought to do is act up to their own theory if they understand it, as we did in 1845 and 1848, to go in for any real general working class movement, accept its actual starting point as such, and work it gradually up to the theoretical level by pointing out how every mistake made, every reverse suffered, was a necessary consequence of mistaken theoretical views in the original program.
mm.
They ought, in the words of the Communist Manifesto, uh, sorry, he quotes it in German. I can't translate the German off the top of my head. Um, oh, I'm sorry. The passage is right here. So they ought, in the words of the Communist Manifesto, in the movement of the present, represent the future of the movement. But above all, give the movement time to consolidate. Do not make the inevitable confusion of the first start worse confounded by forcing down people's throats things which, at present, they cannot properly understand, but which they will soon learn. A million or two working men's votes next November for a bona fide working men's party is worth infinitely more at present than 100,000 votes for a doctrinally perfect platform.
Reminds me a little bit of something a mutual friend of ours has said once: keep Marxism in your back pocket.
Right, exactly.
You don't have to lead with it because the history doesn't call for it in the moment.
And it's not that it doesn't inform what you do, but the point isn't that you have to convert everyone to this perspective on a theoretical basis. The point would really be that the theory comes to bear in practical reality if it's true. If the theory is true, its truth will present itself in
Yeah.
reality as things unfold. But the conditions under which it can actually present that truth are namely the conditions in which the working class is organizing itself as a class and beginning to develop consciousness of its common conditions and common interests as a class. And so that point really kind of begins at the beginnings of the political development of the working class movement. Before that, you have trade union activity, you have local regional activity and organization, and that's like those are like seeds of a future class struggle. But it's not really, as Lenin put it, for example, it's not really a class struggle until it embraces the whole working class. And once it's embracing the whole working class, then it's a question of the political struggle of the working class against the ruling class. It's not simply a question of the workers against their boss or something like that. So that's like really the most important point, is that the first step in terms of applying Marxist theory to reality is finding those tendencies driving in the direction of the political organization of the working class, even if they're elemental, even if they're not really kind of theoretically, coherent or certainly
Hmm.
informed by historical consciousness. But the point would be that those lessons come to bear as the movement develops, if Marxism is true. And that means as the movement develops, we can say this road is dangerous. If we go down this road, it could lead to these defeats, it could lead to these failures, it could lead to these upsets, and so on. And if we're correct, then those warnings will be vindicated through the mistakes that are made. And then in that process, the people that are demoralized by the mistakes are the ones that are probably not receptive to
Mm.
an escalating struggle, whereas the people that will look at it and say, wow, that was right. They were right. We should have listened to them. Maybe we should listen to them next time. That's how that develops. At least that's Engels' perspective.
Yeah, they got to learn from their mistakes. They can't
Right.
just trust you for the perfect, correct outlook
Right.
from day one. That's not going to happen.
Certainly. So I think, that is a good stopping point because we can start, when we do discuss the kind of formation and the early years of the Socialist Party of America, we can see how that process kind of reflects what Engels is saying here in the sense of learning the lessons of the failures of the late 19th century kind of come to bear around the turn of the 20th century and how they're learned or maybe not learned as things develop.
Great. Okay, then that will be either the next episode or if something juicier, spicier comes up in the meantime. We'll see. Thanks everybody for watching. Hope you learned something. I learned something today. Thanks, Reed.
Thank you, Eamon. Good talking to you as always.